every second, a million souls vanish into the meat grinder of the Imperium's endless wars. Most die nameless, forgotten before their corpses grow cold. I should have been one of them, another faceless child of the hive, crushed beneath the weight of smoke, hunger, and decay. But fate had other designs, and the day the black ship came, my life ended so that something else could begin. I was 16, barely grown, when the skies split open above our hive city. A vessel larger than the spires themselves drifted into view, blacker than night, its engines roaring like the judgment of the Emperor. Fear spread faster than plague. Entire families were dragged from their hab-blocks by enforcers and herded into the central square. Vox sirens howled, priests bellowed hymns, and above them all the looming shadow of the Adeptus Astartes fell upon us. I had seen picked screens of space marines, but reality was far crueler. Giants encased in armor thicker than a man's chest, they stood as if nothing could ever move them. They did not acknowledge us as people. We were cattle, lined up and trembling, waiting for the axe to fall. When the selection began, the silence was worse than any lash. A Marine would point, and a boy or girl would be torn from their family's grasp. Some parents resisted, if only for a heartbeat, but Lazefire cut them down where they stood. Honor meant nothing in that square. Obedience was survival. When the armored finger turned to me, my mother screamed. I still hear her voice, raw with terror, as the guardsmen pulled me away. I did not get to say goodbye. I did not get to choose. I was taken, like all the others, into the belly of the black ship. Honor, destiny, glory. The priests promised us these things, chanting that we were blessed beyond measure. But to us, the chosen, it felt like a funeral. For every child dragged aboard, a family was left in mourning. That was the first lesson of the Adeptus Astartes. To be chosen is not to be blessed. It is to be condemned. The engines of the ship howled as it lifted us into the void, our hive city shrinking to a pinprick of light. My old life was gone, burned away like ash in the wind. Ahead waited trials that would strip flesh, mind, and soul until only the Emperor's will remained. If you wish to endure this path with me, to feel the weight of what it means to be remade as something more and less than human, join me. Subscribe and walk the shadowed road where only the angels of death may tread. I was no longer a son, no longer a brother, no longer myself. I was a candidate. And candidates rarely survived.
The journey from the hive world to the chapter's fortress monastery blurred into a haze of fear, hunger, and exhaustion. None of us knew where we were going. The black ship had no windows, no sense of time, only endless darkness, the drone of engines and the barking of enforcers who treated us less like human beings and more like livestock. We were crammed into middle barracks with no privacy, no comfort. Rations came twice a day, tasteless paste that barely kept us alive. Some choked it down in silence, while others wept into their bowls. Fights broke out nightly, territory disputes over bunks, over water, over nothing at all. The weak were broken early, their bodies dragged away by silent servitors. When the ship finally shuddered to a halt, the doors opened onto a world unlike anything I had ever seen. Cold mountain air stung my lungs. Snow swept across jagged peaks, and in the distance stood the fortress monastery, a citadel of black stone, its towers like spears stabbing into the heavens. That was where the trials began. We were herded into a courtyard where drill sergeants, mortals but as merciless as any Astartes, waited with shock mauls and bionic eyes that never seemed to blink. "You are nothing," they shouted. "You are less than nothing. If you wish to rise, prove it. If not, die quickly." And then the culling began. The first test was simple: survive the night. No blankets, no shelter, just the freezing winds that cut to the bone. Dozens never rose again, their corpses collected in silence at dawn. The second was worse. We were marched up the mountain, burdened with stones strapped to our backs. Any who faltered were beaten until they either rose again or lay still forever. I remember the sound most clearly. The crunch of boots on snow, the gasping sobs of children pushed beyond their limits, the snap of bones when someone fell and didn't rise. But I endured, not because I was stronger or braver, but because I was too stubborn to die. Competence, I learned, was survival. I kept my breathing steady. I rationed my strength. I copied the older boys who had the instincts of predators. One of them, a tall youth from the hive's spire, whispered advice through gritted teeth. "Don't fight the mountain, walk with it." I owed him my life, though I would never know his name for long. The third trial was the blood test. We were lined up before an apothecary, his white armor splattered with stains that would never wash away. He drew samples from each of us, his surgical gauntlet humming with hidden tools. Those who failed the genetic criteria were taken aside. We never saw them again. Some whispered they were executed. Others claimed they became servitors, their flesh twisted into mindless machines. I passed, barely. Each day stripped away another layer of who I had once been. We were no longer children. We were candidates, trapped in a crucible of suffering that burned weakness from our bones. And though fear clung to me like a second skin, there was also a spark, something deeper. Hope? No. Hope had no place here. Determination. By the end of that first month, half of us were gone. Those who remained bore the scars, frostbite, broken ribs, bruises that never healed, and still, more trials waited. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale chills your soul. Your support keeps the Emperor's light burning against the void. The next stage would not just test our bodies. It would reach inside us, change us, and reshape us into something both greater and less than human. The gene seed awaited.
The fortress monastery was not just stone and steel. It was a machine for unmaking men and forging something else in their place. By the time we reached the chamber of the apothecaries, I no longer recognized myself in the mirror-polished steel of the halls. My body was thinner, harder, my eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights and endless trials. But the true transformation was only beginning. The gene seed, that sacred curse, that divine blasphemy. We were led into surgical theaters lit by the cold white glow of lumen strips. The air stank of disinfectant, incense, and blood that never fully washed away. Servo arms dangled from the ceilings, tipped with saws, syringes, and scalpels. The apothecaries stood among them, giants in white ceramite, their armor studded with vials and tubes filled with glowing fluid. "Your flesh will be remade," one of them intoned, voice filtered through a box grill that turned it into a hollow growl. "Your failures will be carved out, your weakness excised. You will either rise as sons of the Emperor or perish as fodder." The first implantation was the simplest, the secondary heart. They cut into my chest, and though the painkillers dulled the edge, I felt everything. The steady rhythm of my heartbeat doubled, echoing like war drums in my skull. The world became sharper, my blood hotter, my breath deeper. For hours afterward, I could hear the rush of life through my veins, as if the Emperor himself had stoked a furnace inside me. But each operation grew worse. The ossa modula to change our bones, the biscopia to flood our muscles with growth, the hemastamen to alter our blood forever. Some screamed until their throats bled. Others fell silent, their bodies rejecting the sacred seed. Those who survived carried the weight of new organs, strange instincts, and the sense that we were being hollowed out and filled with something alien. And then came the hypnodoctrination. We were placed in cold sarcophagi, tubes sinking into our skulls, feeding us with visions, catechisms, and knowledge not our own. I saw the 10,000 battles of the chapter, their victories and their endless wars. I learned to strip and rebuild a bolter before I even held one. I felt the litanies of hatred carved into my mind until they echoed in my dreams. Sometimes I wondered where I went during those long hours. My memories of my hive, my family, my name, they blurred, burned away like parchment beneath a flame. In their place grew certainty, devotion, and the heavy truth that I belonged to the chapter now, body and soul. There were moments of competence, even pride amidst the agony. I learned to fight with blade and fist, to move with precision, to anticipate my opponent's weakness before he struck. The instructors called me adaptable, resilient, but praise here was a knife, double-edged. Those who excelled were often pushed harder, tested more cruelly. Tension brewed in every hall. Rivalries turned savage. Friendships ended in blood. The boy from the spire, the one who had whispered advice on the mountain, failed his implantation. I saw him convulse on the steel slab, his eyes rolling back as his body split itself apart. The apothecary did not mourn him. He simply noted the failure, signaled a servitor, and moved to the next candidate. I wanted to scream. Instead, I bowed my head and endured. We began to change outwardly too. Our bodies swelled with muscle, our voices deepened, our eyes burned with strange new clarity. By the time months had passed, we were giants compared to the children who had first arrived. But I was not a space marine, not yet. The final test of the gene seed was not surgical, it was survival. We were each sent into the wilderness beyond the monastery walls, stripped of armor, given only a blade. The task was simple: return alive. The snow howled, the beasts of the mountain stalked. Hunger gnawed at my belly until it felt like fire. Yet through it all, my new heart thundered, my new muscles burned, and my will remained unbroken. When I staggered back through the gates, bloodied but breathing, I was not the same boy who had been dragged from the hive. I was something else. The crucible of battle was next. The tension builds. Subscribe to witness more tales from the Dark Millennium. Few mortals ever glimpse the path of the Angels of Death. Fewer still survive it.
They told us the gene seed had remade our flesh, but it was war that would carve our souls. The day of the crucible arrived without warning. No announcement, no ceremony. We were woken before dawn, marched into the arming chambers, and given weapons for the first time. Not bolters, not power swords, only combat blades and battered training lasguns with failing packs. "This is not training," the drill sergeant barked. "This is judgment. Return with honor or not at all." The gates of the fortress opened, and we were driven into the valley below. Snow fell in thick sheets, but it was not the cold that chilled me. It was the silence of the apothecaries watching from above, their visors unreadable. We were prey, and the valley was the hunting ground. The test began almost immediately. Packs of feral xenos, beasts native to this world, stalked the snowfields. They resembled wolves, but larger, with hides tough as ceramite and eyes that glowed in the dark. The first of us to falter was dragged down screaming, his blade snapping uselessly against the creature's armored skull. I fought not with desperation, but with precision. My new body moved faster, struck harder, endured longer. When one of the beasts leapt at me, I rolled beneath its jaws, driving my blade up through the soft tissue of its throat. Hot blood spilled across the snow, steaming in the cold air. The kill was brutal, but efficient, proof that the gene seed's gifts had not been wasted. Competence meant survival, but survival alone was not enough. The trial demanded unity, and unity was harder to forge than steel. Rivalries that had simmered for months now threatened to break us. Some candidates abandoned the weaker, leaving them to die beneath fangs and claws. Others turned their blades on each other, hoping fewer survivors would mean better odds of ascension. I chose another path. With two others, I formed a bond, thin as thread, but enough to hold. Together, we set traps in the snow, lured beasts into choke points, covered each other's flanks. I learned to trust their movements, to fight not as one, but as three. For the first time, I felt the beginnings of brotherhood. But brotherhood was fragile. On the third night, we reached the ruins of an ancient settlement, long buried in ice. It should have been shelter. Instead, it was an ambush. The instructors had unleashed more than beasts into the valley. They had loosed failed candidates, twisted by partial implants, their minds broken and bodies warped. They came at us in silence, eyes burning with madness, claws where hands had been. I had seconds to react. My blade met flesh, but it was no beast I cut down. It was a boy that I had once spoken to. His face, half familiar beneath scars and tumors. His blood sprayed across the ruins, and something inside me hardened forever. We fought for hours. Las packs ran dry, forcing us back to steel and instinct. One of my brothers fell beneath a broken candidate's jaws, his screams echoing until they were silenced in a wet snap. I did not weep. I could not. There was only the fight. When dawn broke, we staggered back to the monastery gates, 2 survivors where 3 had stood. I carried the body of the fallen on my shoulders, not because the instructors demanded it, but because it felt right. He had been my brother. He would not rot in the snow. At the gates, the apothecaries waited. They said nothing, only scanned us with auspex and recorded their results. To them, we were numbers, data points, test results. But I knew different. I had fought. I had bled. I had endured. And in that crucible, I had become more than the boy torn from the hive. Still with us in the shadows? Comment your theories below. What corruption stalks those who fail the path of the Astartes? The chapter watches, but so too does the darkness. The trials were over. What came next was the final transformation. No longer human, not yet an angel.
By the time the final stage arrived, I no longer thought of myself as the boy who had lived in the hive. That boy was dead. His memories lingered like faint echoes, faces blurred, voices lost, a name I could barely recall. What remained was something else, harder, sharper, built for war. The apothecaries gathered us, what few survived, into the deepest sanctum of the fortress monastery. There, we faced the last rites of transformation, the culmination of months of surgeries, indoctrinations, and trials, the implantation of the black carapace. We were stripped bare, laid upon steel slabs. The apothecaries loomed over us, their tools gleaming under sterile light. The carapace was not simply an organ, it was a living interface, a thin sheath that bonded with our flesh, allowing us to merge with power armor as though it were our own skin. The pain was beyond description. Needles burrowed into my spine, cables threaded beneath my ribs, and the carapace seeped into me like molten iron. My body convulsed against restraints. I bit down so hard I cracked a tooth, yet I refused to scream. Not because I was unafraid, but because I had already learned that pain was a language of the Astartes, and I would speak it without shame. When the procedure ended, I was no longer separate from the machine. I could feel every servo, every pulse of energy in the armor I would one day wear. The apothecary's words echoed through the chamber. "You are no longer human. You are a vessel of the Emperor's wrath." The weeks that followed blurred together in a storm of combat drills, tactical indoctrination, and battle simulations. We learned to move as squads, to fight as one body with many blades. Bolters were finally placed in our hands, their weight like a promise. The first time I fired one, the recoil nearly tore my arm free, but the thunder it unleashed felt like justice given form. Yet not all of us endured. A candidate beside me faltered during training, his reflexes too slow, his spirit too hesitant. The instructor executed him on the spot, a single bolt round through the skull. No ceremony, no farewell, just another reminder that weakness could not be tolerated. Every day was another death, a death of fear, a death of doubt, a death of the self that once was. And yet, in those deaths, something greater was born. The moment of ascension came when the chapter master himself walked among us. A giant clad in ancient armor, his every step reverberated through the stone halls. He studied us one by one, his gaze like a blade cutting into our very souls. When his eyes met mine, I felt stripped bare, not judged as a boy, not even as a candidate, but as a weapon of war. You are no longer children. You are no longer men. You are angels of death, and you will bring the Emperor's justice to a galaxy that knows only sin. That was the moment I understood the truth. I had been remade, not into a hero, not into a savior, but into a weapon of war. My name, my family, my past, they were ashes scattered to the void. I was not myself anymore. I was a space marine. The conclusion would come later, when the weight of that truth sunk in. But in that moment, as the bells of the monastery tolled and the oath of service was carved into our flesh and souls, I felt the final chains of humanity break. I was no longer human, and I would never be again.
To be chosen for the Adeptus Astartes is spoken of as an honor beyond measure, But I know now the truth. It is not honor, but sacrifice. Every step of the path stripped something away: family, name, flesh, soul, until nothing of the boy remained. What rose in his place was an angel of death, sworn to the Emperor, bound to war eternal. We do not live for ourselves. We do not dream. We do not love. We do not hope. We endure. We kill. We die. The Imperium is vast, and it devours its own children without pause, yet we are its chosen sons, its sharpened blades against the darkness. Sometimes, in the stillness before battle, I remember fragments: a mother's scream, a friend's whispered advice, a name I can no longer bear to speak. Those memories hurt more than the surgeries ever did, but they remind me of what was lost and why I fight. This is what it means to be recruited into the Space Marines. Not glory, but surrender. Not honor, but burden. The Emperor's light burns eternal, but it demands fuel, and we are the fire.